Hello, and welcome to the Taking Back the Narrative podcast. So, as many of you know, this season I've been focusing on the post Jewish genocide reality. And for today, I very much want to welcome a very esteemed guest, Leora Levy. So, Leora, I met you in a bit of a roundabout way. I remember it so distinctly. It was the RNC retreat in New Orleans, and I didn't know a single soul there. And I had gotten an email from one of the RNC staffers ahead of my trip saying, "Oh, I would love for you to meet Leora Levy. She's running for Senate out of Connecticut." And I was so excited. I was like, "Oh my gosh, a Senate hopeful." I had worked on several campaigns, but not that high up. And just our scheduling was not working out during that convention. So we ended up not, or at least through emails, ended up not officially meeting. But I remember sitting down at the dinner. It was where President Trump was speaking. I don't know if you remember, but he was 10 feet away from us. And I sat next to a gentleman who happened to be your husband, and he and I were talking about Israel and the importance of Jews voting for Israel. And next thing I know, your husband says, "Oh, you have to meet my wife, Leora." So we switched seats. You and I sat together and we talked about how your family came from Cuba to escape socialism or communism, actually.
Yeah.
We talked about our love for Israel. We talked about your Senate run. And I remember the first call I made after that dinner was to my mom. I said, "Mom, I just met such a powerful
Oh,
Jewish Republican woman who is making waves in the political field." And she's like, "Yeah, I want to learn more about her." And that's how our friendship began. So thank you so much for taking time to be on the TBTN podcast.
well, thank you for having me, and I'm so touched by your very, very kind introduction. I do remember when we met, and I do, and also just knowing that I kind of had met a kindred spirit. So,
Absolutely. So if you could tell the audience a little bit more, an overview of your background, and we'll get into more of the details as we speak.
yes, well, I want to go a little bit further back than Cuba because actually on my mother's side, my mother and grandparents escaped Lithuania in 1940. She was born there. That's where that side of the family had been for generations. And they left because not I'm sure my grandfather, being a smart man, saw what was coming because Poland had already been invaded by the Nazis. But the real reason, catalyst for leaving, was the death of their 3-year-old son named Leo, after whom I'm named. And I consider him the angel that, frankly, his death is the reason that my mother and grandparents survived, and the rest of a very large, vibrant Jewish family. Almost every single one of them was murdered in the Holocaust, in the forest whether it was concentration camps, forest massacres. Some survived the concentration camps, went back to their homes in Lithuania, and were then murdered by their Lithuanian neighbors who had taken the homes. So I am very aware that I have an obligation to make a difference with my life. There's a reason that our part of the family survived and that I was born, and that really does motivate me in everything that I do. Um, again, the reasons that I got into politics, there are two. One, to make sure the United States of America never becomes a communist country because of what my family experienced having to escape communism. And two, to make sure that the United States and Israel are always, always the closest of allies, and that the United States doesn't abandon Israel, as I fear is happening right now with the Biden and Harris administration.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for all that you do. If we only had thousands of Leora Levy's, then this country would have been in a much better shape than it is right now. Just a personal addition to what you said about your family. So, your grandfather was indeed very smart, because actually, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, ended up saving my family because her father, my great grandfather, it's not that he wasn't smart. I just think that a lot of Jews back then in Europe were fooled because Germany in World War I indeed left Jews alone.
Mhm.
And so when the Nazis were approaching, they lived in Belarus. Uh, my grandmother, who was 21 at the time, was sounding the alarm to the family. And as you know now Jewish women are very strong voices, but back then it was very unique for a Jewish woman to stand up to her father, the head of the family, to tell them otherwise. And so he said, "Oh, no need to flee. The Nazis aren't going to touch us." So, to make a long story short, my grandmother arranged for the escape of the entire family, it was a large family, to the Ural Mountains, 16 hours away. 5 days later, the Nazis came into Belarus, and all the Jews who were left behind, most of them were murdered. And just like you said, it was not by the Nazis themselves, it was by the local populations that enthusiastically joined the Nazis. And many of those Jews never made it to the concentration camps. They were shot, left in ravines, and that's something that's not talked about.
Yes, my mother actually, she was 6 years old at the time, but she said she used to tell us she's still alive, thank goodness. So is my dad. They're 93, but she has dementia, unfortunately. But she did used to say she remembers a family meeting, a big family meeting, and that the somebody in the family said, "Oh, we have nothing to worry about. You know, Hitler, what does he want with Lithuania? All we have are pigs and trees." My family was in the lumber business, actually, in Lithuania.
So was my family, but in
Oh,
Poland.
that's interesting. Huh.
I wonder
So
if
anyway, most of the family stayed,
right.
but my grandparents and my mother
They had
escaped.
that.
There were a couple of other brothers who left before my mother and grandparents went to Cuba. And that's the only reason that when, after a perilous journey through Nazi Germany, passing as non-Jews on a train full of SS officers and getting to Naples and taking one of the last American ocean liners out of Italy before the America got in the war, they actually got to Ellis Island, but were turned away because they were Jews. There was a quota. FDR had a quota for Jews, and they were being sent back to Germany, but luckily were able to get visas to Cuba because of the other relatives who had already gone there.
And can we just add how little the quota was? I was astounded when I read that. And I knew that there were quotas when I was in school, but no one mentioned it was 1,000 Jews.
I never knew it was that
uh,
little.
Yeah,
Oh my
1,000
God.
Jews during the entire World War II, which obviously lasted for about, the Holocaust lasted 6 years.
Yeah.
1,000 Jews. That is insanity. And
That's anti-Semitism right there.
Absolutely. So, and we're going to get into
Yeah.
Jews and the voting patterns despite actual history. So, all the guests, I used to ask every guest, how did October 7th change them? But then I realized maybe there is a better question. It's not how did October 7th change someone, because or did October 7th change someone? Because all Zionist Jews were absolutely changed by October 7th. And I always say that it was not an attack, it was not a massacre, it was indeed a Jewish genocide. Because yes, of course, there were non-Jews who absolutely were murdered, but the non-Jews were not hunted. And the Jews were absolutely hunted. There was a Bedouin farmer who shared that 8 Jews ran onto his property, and he directed them where to hide under his barn. And then Hamas terrorists followed about 15, 20 minutes later. They were looking for those Jews. And that pattern repeated. They were asking, where are the Jews? Where are the Yehud? And so we properly need to name exactly what happened. So for you, how did October 7th change you?
Well, I don't know that it changed me. It just strengthened me to know to make sure that I spoke out and that I acted to do whatever I can to make sure that Americans understood what happened. And one thing I want to say, while they absolutely Hamas terrorists were hunting the Jews, there were many non-Jews who were killed and taken hostage as well.
Right, absolutely.
Because they were in Israel, because they were maybe non-Jewish Israelis, or they were working there. The Thai workers at Kibbutz Nir Oz, where I went 6 weeks after October 7th, and I saw the evidence of what happened to them there. Thai workers were taken hostage too. They suffered as well, and yes, the majority of the people were Jewish, and the point, Hamas's reason for doing it, is to get to eliminate Israel, eliminate the Jews. But the Gentiles who were there suffered as well.
Oh yeah, of course.
I don't want to discount that at all.
No, we acknowledge that. I'm just saying that in terms of naming it, I hear on the news so often that it was an attack, and it's very minimizing how people, most people, especially in the media,
it was a genocide against anyone who had anything to do with the state of Israel that they could get their hands on.
Right, but
they didn't spare the Bedouin. There was a Bedouin man released recently. They didn't spare him. They didn't spare the Thai workers.
Right. So he was the one who actually did acknowledge that it was a Jewish genocide, because he said that as harshly as he was being treated in the tunnels, that the Jewish
were treated worse.
were much worse. And so he said that they were hunting the Jews. And so, of course, there were many non-Jews who were killed. We're not discounting that, but it was a Jewish genocide in that they were targeting a specific ethnic group.
Yes, and it wouldn't have happened if Israel wasn't a Jewish nation.
Exactly, right.
It just wouldn't have.
Absolutely. No, so your work has been great. So I know that you did that trip, you organized that trip with the RNC.
I did it. It was really a Republican trip. At the time, I was the Republican National Committeewoman from Connecticut, so I invited all of my RNC colleagues, fellow members from other states, and the officers of the RNC, because the Republicans in the RNC are extremely Zionist and extremely philo-Semitic. I can't tell you how many resolutions over the 8 years I was there I worked on with fellow members who were not Jewish, supporting Israel, opposing anti-Semitism. When there was a Nazi candidate in Skokie who signed up to run as a Republican at the last minute, we wrote a resolution telling people not to vote for this person, that we rejected him. So we have great support. We, meaning Jews, and Israel have great support in the RNC. But I also invited former Trump administration officials. So it was a very high-level delegation. And the reason I did this is, going back, if you go back 50 years to Yom Kippur of 1973, I had gotten back from my first trip to Israel with our Temple USY group about 6 weeks earlier. And I remember sitting in synagogue and the rabbi announcing the Yom Kippur attack in Israel. And I immediately said to my parents, I want to go back. And they looked at me and said, well, you're 16 years old. What do you think you're going to do? You're not going back. I felt powerless. But I knew when I woke up on October 7th, 2023, and heard the horrific news about the attack, I knew I wasn't powerless, and I knew that I could do something to make a difference. So that's why I organized this high-level delegation. We went there as fact-finding, to lend our moral support, and to come back and bear witness to what we saw and what we learned, so that the truth would come out, and that the propaganda from those who reject Israel and who oppose Israel, just to put the lie to everything they were saying.
So the trip was well received among the Republicans.
Extremely well received. And I can tell you that there were many other fellow members of the RNC who wanted to join us, but whose families were afraid of for them to go so soon during a war, during so soon after it happened, and while there was a war going on. As you can remember, if you remember, every airline except El Al canceled all its flights. It was
Yes.
so there were people who wanted to go, but out of deference to their family couldn't. But what I did then is I raised money. They made contributions, and with that money we bought gift cards, which we ended up giving to people who had been displaced from their kibbutzes in the south and were living in a hotel in the Jerusalem area.
That's so moving that still people wanted to contribute if they still
Absolutely,
if they
they
could
wanted
not,
to.
if they
And
could
I
not
know,
go.
and frankly, now that we're talking about it, I am just starting to plan another trip for, so I would like to do it around the week of November 18th after the US election, before Thanksgiving. And if anybody who's listening would be interested, maybe through you, they could, they could get in touch with you, and then you could put them in touch with me.
I would love to be a conduit. And off the record, I have some logistical questions because that's actually good timing. So for me, I was, to me, October 7th changed me. I don't know if you know, I was not always pro-Israel. For 20 years, I was actually anti-Israel because of a
Oh,
lot of misinformation. And well, I didn't even know that I was a Jew until I was about 7, 8 years old. Just being Jewish is not something my parents grew up talking about, having come from communist country. And when they came to America, they were busy rebuilding their lives and not sending me to Hebrew school. So I found out I was a Jew. It's a whole interesting story for another time. I've shared it before. And I desperately wanted to go to Hebrew school, but my parents did not like the rabbi locally. We only had one because he was liberal. And they said, we did not just escape communism for you to be indoctrinated. So long story short, they ended up taking me to Israel for my bat mitzvah. My Haftorah portion was transliterated upon the Masada, and I loved the trip and came back. I was very Zionist, or as much as one could be after one trip, and not knowing much else about Judean history. And then within a year, that was it. I started watching CNN and reading the New York Times and The Economist. Yes, at 14 years old, and that's it. I saw that Israel was being vilified, and I completely understood why, because there was such things called apparently settlements. No one was pushing back that those are legal Jewish communities. In the press and the papers, they were talking about how Israel stole land from the Arabs. No Jewish organization was pushing back that's not happened. And in fact, it was the opposite. The Arabs occupied 78% of our land, and then in the future, additionally, Gaza as well. And then, of course, with the Oslo terrorist accords, 2/3 of Judea and Samaria are actual ancestral heartland. So, needless to say, for many of those years, most of my friends were non-Jews. And whenever Israel would be on the news, they would turn to me, their token Jewish friend, and say, "Oh, could you explain Israel's actions?" With delight. And then I would spread anti Semitism because I was repeating all of the anti Semitic talking points. I truly believe that there were Palestinians and Jews, that there was an Israel and a Palestine. And when I moved to New York, I joined some Jewish organizations just to make some Jewish friends. Most of my friends, again, were non Jews, and they used that anti Semitic terminology. So I was just convinced that we are two people. And again, all the Jews I knew were talking about how we're from Europe, and then the Palestinians are indigenous. And it's just this anti Semitic mishmash that contributes to misinformation. So, like when we see these Hamas protests, which unfortunately I've been inundated with for nearly the past year, I guarantee you half of them are not protesting because they hate Jews. They are protesting because the misinformation they receive is so intricately tied to their reality, to the reality that's on, in the media. So I always say to Jews, the best way to fight anti-Semitism, obviously knowing the facts, using correct terminology, but it's to put yourself in a roundabout way in your enemy's position. So think about this. Like if you didn't know anything, if you were not a Jew, you didn't know anything about Israel, and all you heard about Israel was all of the anti-Semitic lies, I guarantee you, maybe we wouldn't be protesting, with Hamas flags, but we would not have a favorable approach to Jews or to Israel. We're thinking, oh, so if someone can be a Jew, but no one's talking about how Jews are indigenous, to Israel. So they see Christians. Well, Christians are everywhere. They practice, their religion everywhere. And no one's explaining that Jews are not a religion. We have a faith, of course, but we're a race and we're indigenous to our homeland. And so it's unearthing that truth. That's what makes a difference. And I've seen it. I work with Arabs all the time. And once they learn the facts, they then share it with their family, with their towns. And that's how change is being made. So for me, I was completely shocked. I was in Israel, actually for Sukkot last year. And I remember flying into Israel being afraid because there were so many protests. Remember how divided Israel was over judicial reform,
Yeah.
non-judicial reform. So I didn't know what I was going to be facing. And what I saw was just this amazingly unified country, perhaps because of the holiday of Sukkot. No one was talking about politics. There were no protests. I was hopping from Sukkot to Sukkot every single night. And what was interesting to me, and this is sad that that's reality, that it was jarring to me, every single trip I've been on to Israel, I've been 6 times prior to that trip, there's always been a terrorist attack, if not multiple, usually in Judea and Samaria, sometimes down south. There were no terrorist attacks the week of Sukkot that I was there. And for those who may not know, prior to October 7th, I was very, very pro-Arab. And, I was riding on the coattails of the Abraham Accords, not giving up on them, but, we might need to reevaluate some aspects of the Abraham Accords. So it's very, very pro-Arab. And I wanted to take my friend to an Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem. I felt so comfortable. Like I literally had my guard down. And so when I came back on October 6th. And in the morning, my sister calls me. She never calls me in the morning and says, turn on the news. Look what's happening in Israel. I said, and I probably had like 2 hours of sleep, I was jet lagged. And I said, Ellie, nothing's happening in Israel. I just came from there. Everything's fine. And we obviously knew it was quite the opposite. So I was in shock. I couldn't function, for weeks. And then I was angry. I was angry that Israel's security, like we as Jews feel so safe, usually because we have Israel, right? Because like Israel is powerful. Israel has this amazing army. Israel protects Jews, even if you don't live, in Israel. And so it was the first time I felt not safe, right? Like Israel let us down. I'm not saying the Israeli people are incredible. The leadership, the policies over the years. And just to wind down with this juxtaposition, in 2022, I had been all over the Arab world. I've been to Egypt and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and we ended up in UAE. It was my second trip to UAE. Now, Egypt was doing the complete opposite of what Israel was doing. And as we know, who are the Gazans? They're mostly Egyptians because Egypt in 1948 resettled 250,000 of their nationals and radicalized them. But in Egypt, they have no concept of peace with anyone from Gaza. It's something that they don't even talk about. And I remember talking to some Egyptians during the trip, and I said, oh, there are some Israelis who are seeking peace with those in Gaza. And they laughed. They said, why would they want peace with terrorists? They're talking about their fellow brothers. And they said, we have a closed border 11 months out of the year, except during Ramadan. We would never give any one of them a work permit. There's no even thought of having any Gazans work inside Egypt. We don't drive them to hospitals. They have 36 of their own. This is before the war. And Sisi, President Sisi in 2014, he bombed Rafah. He destroyed 1,200 tunnels. He bombed 3,000 buildings and expanded the buffer between Rafah and Gaza and built a steel wall. So it's not just one little fence, it's a series of walls there. So it made me really resolve in explaining the geopolitics of the Middle East and what actually needs to be done in order for these Jewish genocides never to happen again. So it's interesting that through politics, right, like yourself, and through me, obviously we know the importance of the election that's coming up and the disaster, and we'll get into this a little bit later, the disastrous ways that the current administration contributed actually also to October 7th. So it made me realize,
October 7th, let's be clear,
yeah,
it never would have happened if President Trump were in office.
right,
Never would have happened. In fact, the
right.
Middle East would be a very different place today had President Trump been in office.
The issue, though, and I'm going to push back a little bit. I mean, absolutely. President Trump kept the entire world safe, right? Ukraine was an invasion.
Ukraine also,
Right.
another
Ukraine, Taiwan
never
was
would have
safer.
happened.
Right. Taiwan was safer. But I just want to emphasize, Israel relies so much on America. And this is my strong opinion. It's time that it doesn't, because the problem with our election cycles in our politics, we vacillate too much, right? Like we go from one extreme to another. We go from these anti-Americans to MAGA. And President Trump, I mean, of course, like he's the reason I'm so involved in politics, because before I don't know, I would go to the polls and I would eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Like, I mean, I was a Republican, but to me, and I want you to explain further as we get into our conversation. But to me, I didn't see much of a difference, between Democrats and Republic back before President Trump. Now I see clearly there was, but at the time I was not informed. So I would say, I actually voted for Schumer once. I know, I voted for Cuomo because I just didn't recognize the Republican name. I was like, who is this person? Now I obviously learned
Obviously, it's a problem with the Republican Party. We
yeah.
were not getting our message across very clearly enough.
Right.
Because
And also, and President Trump, like he was a populist, and he realized that he truly put America first, and there's no delineation between there's no delineation between there's no confusion between who the Democrats are and who the Republicans are. So for me, President Trump in 2016 woke me up, but it was also coincided for when it became a Zionist. It became a Zionist in 2014. And it was shortly after that, then I took a look around, and I realized which party is harming Israel and which party is helping Israel. But the problem is with Israel. So of course, we're all very much hoping and working hard to get President Trump elected. So he's going to defund, obviously, again, defund the terrorist parties. He's going to hopefully bankrupt Iran, hopefully doing something else. Again, right. There's a whole lineage.
Well, one thing Israel's doing now is making them spend more of their money. That's for sure.
Right, that's true. But here's the thing. So cost. President Trump, unfortunately, can't run for another term, right? He can only serve one more term. What's going to happen then? It's going to be up to Israel and its policies, hopefully the right ones for safety, to ensure that no matter who is in the White House is inoculated against contributing to terrorism against Jews. So it's, I don't know. Like, I feel like for me, this whole year either flew by in a week, or it's been lasting 10 years. Like, do you feel that too? This dichotomy of this time span? I feel like it just happened, and I feel like it happened like years ago. October 7th.
No, it is incredible that it's been almost a year now since it happened.
We still have hostages,
and the hostages are still there, and that's just very difficult to stomach, frankly.
Absolutely. And what has President Biden done to even try to get out?
He's never even mentioned, as far as I know, he's rarely, if ever, mentioned their names, ever. And the same with Harris.
Right.
The same with Harris. They're one and the same.
And that's why
if anybody who's thinking of voting, any Jew who thinks of voting for Kamala Harris is voting on the wrong issues. They are fooling themselves if they think that she will maintain this relationship as it is. And Israel, just like we learned with COVID that we need to have our own sources of supplies for certain things like antibiotics and other things that we relied on China for. Israel, unfortunately, has learned a very difficult lesson that they can't rely on the United States because of our 4-year election cycles, because of the nature of our democracy. But that's our system and that's our country, and it's up to us to make sure the American people understand the importance of supporting Israel and of maintaining that alliance. But Israel really does have to develop their own weapons sources, their own, make them themselves. If they have to do that.
And finally, they're starting to. So David's shield, luckily, does not need any American parts, unlike the Iron Dome.
Yeah.
So that's going to give them a lot of.
The shame is that they canceled years ago. They canceled the Levy project because America didn't want them to build a jet that would compete with ours, frankly. And it's a shame that that was probably a short-sighted decision on the Israeli government's part.
Right, to accept that, of course.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that your family escaped from Cuba, to come to the United States. So my family also escaped, from a communist country to come to America. How exactly? And I'm sure there were different stories through that, because Cuba, even though it's the same political system, or at least Russia used to be, right? Like Russia is no longer communist. People still get that confused. I said, no, Russia stopped being communist in 1991.
No, it's a dictatorship.
Right. But it's not communist. So
it's not communist. No.
If anything, it's a hyper capitalist dictatorship, which is how the oligarchs rose to power as well.
It's an oligarchy.
Exactly. But for Cuba, the system is still there. So I can imagine that your family's situation was different. So how did your family escape from Cuba to come here?
Well, on my father's side, my family's American.
Mm-hmm.
My grandparents were born in America. Their parents were born in America. My father is an American citizen by birth because both his parents were born in America, were natural born Americans. He was born in Cuba, but to American parents. So he is an American citizen by birth through my dad. I'm 4th generation American, except he didn't spend enough time in the United States to pass that citizenship to me. So I am a naturalized American citizen.
That's so interesting how that works.
He was educated in America. He has 2 engineering degrees from MIT, which is the one thing Castro couldn't take from him. And is the reason he was able to get a good job once he did get out to provide for our family. But he had gone to summer camp in America, but it wasn't enough time cumulatively to pass citizenship to his children. And my mother was not an American citizen, obviously. She was at the time she was a Cuban citizen by then. She arrived in Cuba as a 6 or 7-year-old. And
your parents met in Cuba, right?
They met in Cuba.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
They met in Cuba. My mother also was educated, went to college in the United States, but then they both returned to Cuba and ended up getting married and having a family there. But my father's family, my grandfather was one of the largest sugar producers in the world. Oh. It was an American company, but it operated in Cuba. Had sugar mills there, railroad ships to bring the sugar to the United States. He was a leader of the American expat community in Cuba, and he was used to go and testify in Congress every year on America's sugar policy, what it should be in Cuba. He had ties to the State Department as well, and warned the American government that Castro was a communist, that they should do everything they could to prevent him from coming to power. And unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears in the State Department at that time.
So were your parents always Republicans after they came here?
No, my parents were not Republicans at all. They were Democrats, believe it or not.
Okay, so we can talk about the elephant in the room
I
here.
converted them. But I was always a Republican. When I became aware of the first of politics, the first presidential election I really remember, I do remember Kennedy, but my parents were Kennedy Democrats, let's put it that way. That has to do with their being Jewish.
And were they aware? So I just learned this not fun fact because I have a weekly newsletter, and a couple of times I was very clear how anti-Semitic the Democrats have been, and I would always say except for Kennedy, because online you see all of his wonderful statements about Israel. Right, Israel has the right to exist. He's talking about the imported Arabs into Israel, and on and on and on. I had no clue that Kennedy was deeply against the Israeli nuclear program.
I had no idea of that either.
I didn't know that either.
I'm not a fan of Kennedy because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the way and the Bay of Pigs, frankly. Right. The Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis. I think they were mishandled by Kennedy, but that's another issue. I was always, the minute when I found out the story of my mother and grandparents' escape from Europe and how they were rejected and turned away from the United States by FDR, I immediately became a Republican. I just said to myself, I'm never going to be a Democrat. I'm a Republican. And as it turned out, my grandparents on my father's side were Republicans. So
okay, so
it was a little I had some genes, and my aunt, my father's sister, was always a Republican. So it was in my family, though my immediate parents were Democrats. And but when
have they seen the light since?
Oh yes, they became independents with Reagan. I'm not sure if they've changed their registration, but they only vote Republican.
Okay, perfect. And that's good enough. So in my family, it was quite different because, again, they were so against communism. So they left primarily due to anti-Semitism, but communism was a close second. So as soon as they got here, with whatever little money they had, the first purchase was a shotgun. And that was it. They registered Republican and that's—
Where did you grow up? What part of the country?
Oh, I grew up in New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
So back then, Bergen County, New Jersey was very, I would say, purple leaning light red. But and I apologize on behalf of my generation, I'm a millennial, and I know you have children, so I don't know if they say the same thing.
My children are millennials.
Yeah, your children are around the same age. Although I'm an older millennial, I'm 41. Okay. So everyone in my high school, almost everyone, has been voting Democrat. And a lot of them are Jews. And so we have to talk about this. I call it the elephant in the room. Why? When there has been insurmountable evidence from FDR, like we mentioned, right? First of all, he was anti-Semitic. He didn't bomb the train tracks. He could have. He obviously was not letting in Jewish refugees. He had that insane quota, anti-Semitic quota, right, of 1,000 Jews. He did everything possible against Jews. So, and then it was not—
that had a lot to do also with his State Department, the Dulles brothers, and
I understand, but he himself, right?
Like, I mean, no, but yes, it was not just right. It was his cabinet. It was his.
It was everyone, right? And of course,
not just.
And also, wasn't there a Jewish? Someone Jewish was also in his cabinet that was not in favor of bombing the train tracks or not even letting in the Jewish refugees. I forgot his name, but Felix something. I'll get back to you on that.
Frankfurter.
Yeah,
he was eventually in the Supreme Court. It could have been. I mean, there were. What can you say?
There's always been self-hating Jews or Jews who don't.
And there still are.
Unfortunately. So that's the thing. So for me, I never was a registered Democrat. I just, quite frankly, I didn't care enough. I only thought about politics come election time. And like I mentioned, if I didn't recognize the name of a Republican, I just went to the Democrats. And, I didn't know Schumer's policies on Israel or Iran. Well, and this was before Iran, right? So this is prior to 2016.
Well, Schumer actually, when he was in Congress, I mean, in those days, I was active. My husband and I were active in APAC, but we got to a point where we realized we just we couldn't be bipartisan anymore. We just couldn't. We had to just,
Right.
it didn't make sense to be, the Democrats did not support Israel, frankly.
Right. And that's the thing. So could you explain from a more advanced angle?
But Schumer initially, as a congressman, was more supportive of Israel than he is today as the majority leader in the Senate.
Right. And so, yeah, so that's the thing. It's like, for me, it's like, okay, well, I know of him, I'll vote for him. But yeah, it was, I became a Zionist in 2014. And of course, President Trump 2016, that was the shift that I needed. So from a more, again, like advanced angle than I could provide, because one of the most frequent questions I get from my non-Jewish friends, especially my Republican friends, because I have very little non-Republican friends anymore. It's hard when you don't have the same values and you're being accused of being a Nazi and you're being accused of being a fascist, which ironically is everything that the Nazis were. The Nazis were socialists.
Yeah.
The Nazis were not on the right at all. Someone needs to look into how they actually governed and their political affiliations. So the most frequent question I get asked, and not in an anti-Semitic way, but in a curious way, why do so many Jews in America vote against their interests?
I am asked the same question.
And how
the only way I can, so many Americans have assimilated so much and really have just, they don't feel that being Jewish and that our traditional religion matters anymore, because they're safe in America, and they have been brainwashed into thinking social issues and social justice is what Judaism means, and it isn't. It couldn't be further from the truth. So it's justice. We have tzedakah, justice,
right,
not social justice.
Would you say it's a bastardization of Tikkun Olam?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love, if you read my bio, I cite Tikkun Olam as part of what motivates me. But I don't define it the way they do. I don't define it the way they do. I literally want to do what I can to improve the world, but that doesn't mean unlimited abortions and, climate change and all of that.
And also not against the interest. So like, I mean, I have a sister.
Not against my own interests. No.
Exactly. Not against her own interests. And I have a sister who's liberal. And I mean, she woke up after.
As do I.
And did your sister wake up after October 7th? Mine did. But
my sister, I should say that my sister and I are in a process of dialogue, which we couldn't have before. But we are in a respectful dialogue right now. She is extremely troubled by what's happening with this administration, but she is not convinced that President Trump is her cup of tea, and I'm trying to, we're discussing it. Let's put it in a respectful way.
Same with my sister. And that's the thing that I don't understand. So many Jews are waking up to the fact that, okay, so the Democrats are not being pro-Israel, but they're afraid of President Trump. And again, it's the propaganda. So, but let's backtrack a little bit. So why there's so many Jews. So the way I say it kind of mirrors what you said too, which is that a lot of Jews in America don't know who they are. Just like I didn't know who I was for 20 years. Growing up, people would say, "What's your background?" And I would say, "Oh, I'm Russian." I didn't know better. My parents were never Russian. My parents were never considered Slavic. On their passport, it said, well, not J, because it's how do you say in Russian? Zhid is like a kike in Russian for Jew. So that would not be on their passport. That's what they were called. So that's how I know that word. Yavreka. So it'd be like a Y. And it didn't say Belarusian on their passport at all. So, but I didn't know anything like that. I didn't know that I was a Jew. So a lot of American Jews, in my opinion, they still answer the same way. Like look at what's his name, Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders. He always say
Yeah.
that he's Polish. You're not a Pole, you're a Jew. And so, when I became a Zionist, I did a lot of research on Judeans and how we're indigenous. And again, like we are a race, we are an ethnicity, we have a strong faith. There are only three religions in the world, right? Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, because um, I'll send I can attach a really interesting video by Rudy.
I have to tell you, I disagree with you. Judaism is a religion. There are many Jews of other races, of many races, and there are Jews from the Ethiopian Jews are Jews. The Ashkenazic Jews are Jews. The Mizrahi or Sephardim are Jews. We are not all. We have some common DNA, but we're not all the same race.
No, we are,
And
because
so
race.
I
just want to push back on that. So race is
that's
not.
fine, but I don't consider myself a Jewish race. I consider myself a Jew by religion, and
I can respect that, but let me push back.
my core. But
okay, so this is why. So there is a more modern interpretation or explanation. So white, mongoloid, and negroid were racist classifications of skull shapes. And because there was no genetic testing, there was no study of genetics, right? Like until a certain point. So once genetics became an actual area of study, they realized that haplogroups is what defines race. So for example, Ashkenaz Jews, they found out, are indigenous originally to Israel. And that is what proves our indigeneity to Israel. That's what actually proves against the anti-Semitic lie that Jews are from Europe, Jews are invaders, right? Like everything we hear.
No, and I'm 99% Ashkenazi.
Right. So they found that Ashkenaz Jews and Arabs have more in common DNA than Ashkenaz Jews with anyone from Europe, right? Because for most of history, it was illegal to marry Jews. You'd be, put to death, and not just all over Europe, but also amongst the Muslim nations, and even in South America, the Inquisition countries as well. So there was no intermarriage, and the Khazar theory was debunked many times. Like Ashkenaz Jews are not Khazars. So where did Ashkenaz Jews come from? So they discovered that it was 20,000 Italian Sephardic Jews who first came to the Ashkenaz region, and then following them were other Sephardim who were coming east to escape persecution. So every Ashkenaz Jew today is descended from Sephardim. And where did Sephardim come from originally? They all came from Judea. It's historically lined up. As for Ethiopian Jews, I was at a conference, ESMEA conference, and there were African researchers there who very philo-Semitic, and they shared that actually Ethiopian Jews are different. They did genetic testing that some of their leaders in the past had some Jewish genes, but the far majority of Ethiopians, and I still consider them Jews. If Israel considers them Jews, then I have no problem, of course, very Zionist, but the majority of Ethiopians were actually Christian converts, and they joined the Jews to escape military service and to, find different favors, away from the government. And that is why Israel was not being racist when they were deliberating whether to accept Ethiopian Jews into Israel. You remember they were accused of being racist and they were against blacks.
But they did.
Eventually. But the reason it took such a long time, Israel's not racist, but they have a policy to only accept Jews that are genetically Jews, because it's a tiny country. They didn't know what to do with the Arabs, who were mostly occupiers. And so the reason they let in the Ethiopians, because Ethiopians who were living as Jews in Ethiopia were being persecuted for decades by various governments. And they at least were following some principles of our faith. Now, contrast that to the Igbo Jews. There are 40 million Igbo Jews in Nigeria who claim that they're Jews, who claim that Biafra is their Jerusalem. Israel does not recognize them because there is no genetic component whatsoever. They don't live as Jews for the most part. And so we have to be careful when we welcome everyone into the tent, we lose the actual indigenous link. Like, and for example, like, my sister was just pregnant a couple years ago, and the doctor asked her, are you Jewish genetically? Because if you are, we have to do specific testing.
Yeah, the
Right.
Tay-Sachs test.
The Tay-Sachs. Or when I was in the hospital, I was septic shock. I had non-Jewish doctors and they were asking me, like, are you Jewish? Because we don't know what's going on with you. We need to do extra testing. If a Jew needs a bone marrow transplant, can only get it from a Jewish bone marrow bank. So it's very much a race, and it's that race. So we're part of the J1 haplogroup, and we used to be part of the J2 haplogroup together with Arabs. That's why they say Arabs and Jews are cousins. We very much are. Eventually, yeah, and we
Without
split.
a doubt.
Right, we split thousands of years ago
Yeah.
because the human migration patterns, the way they happened, and Jews literally emerged from the Semitic tribes, because everyone in Israel were Semitic, from the Semitic tribes in Judea and Samaria. And I also grew up thinking that we're a religion. It's not a bad thought to have, but what they're defining now, applicable to all of history, that religion, to be a religion, it's to have the following criteria: to spread across borders with intent and force. We do not. And to seek converts. Those are the only purposes of actual religions. And then everyone else, so Jews, Yazidis, Assyrians, Hindus are also not a religion because they are an indigenous population that also have a strong faith, customs, and culture. The Japanese, the Shinto faith is not a religion because the Japanese are indigenous to their land. So this is important. And I really want to emphasize that shift in thinking, for a lot of Jews. And this is important in today's context with the anti-Semitic lies that are being hurled at us when we're being accused of being occupiers and colonizers.
I'm with you.
Right. Right. Exactly. So to turn that around with facts, and they also say, like, oh, so if you're a religion, like the Jewish religion, then you can practice your religion anywhere in the world. Give up Israel, give it back to the indigenous Arabs, and
we're the only ones who
right.
recognize Jerusalem as our capital. Have been praying for thousands of years about.
And we're also right, and we're also in the land. And then another thing too, why we're not a religion, because not all Jews believe in God. And so Rudy Rockman, I disagree with him with a lot of
and that's a problem. That's one of our problems, frankly.
Well, I mean, I'm secular, so so to say that I wasn't a Jew for decades, that's also not true. So that's the thing. So religions, Rudy Rockman has this great video called "Judaism is Not a Religion," and it was backed by JTV. So he explains it really clearly. So he says, okay, if someone's a Christian, they're only a Christian as long as they believe in Jesus. The minute they stop believing in Jesus, they're no longer a Christian, right? Same thing with being a Muslim. If you accept Muhammad as a prophet, you're a Muslim. The second that you stop believing in that, you're now an ex-Muslim. With Jews and the other ethnicities that I mentioned that are also have faiths and not religions, you can believe in a purple donkey. I mean, weird if you do, but you can believe in anything you want and still be that ethnicity, right? Like we have, again, I don't agree with them at all. We have Jews for Jesus. We have Boo Jews, Jewish Buddhists. We have Jews who are atheists. We have Jews who think that they're ex-Jews, but you never stop being a Jew, right? You're still ethnically a Jew from the time you're born to the day you die. And whether you follow our faith, hopefully, or you do nothing, you're still a Jew. So it's fascinating because my eyes were also open to all of these new ways to explain who we are. And it's interesting too that in ancient Hebrew, again, I just learned this about a year ago, in ancient Hebrew, there was no word for religion. And it was actually anti-Semitic Christians who mislabeled Jews in Europe as a religion, because back then everyone was, you're either Catholic or you're a Protestant or this or that. So when Jews came to Europe, they didn't know what to do with us. And so the Judeans, they didn't know how to explain, well, we are an ethnicity and we're just Judean, because like Judeans back then, practicing our faith was just part and parcel of our culture, right? Because our faith is so central to our culture. Like if you think about it, anything we do as Jews, it is tied around to our faith, our holidays, like, our daily life, for many of us. So they just lumped us together, but it's actually, we are a pre-religious entity. And so are the Shintos, and so are the Hindus. So it's very, very fascinating how the dialogue is shifting on that in order to truly push back on anti-Semitism. So I know I went off on a tangent, but I think it's important to explain the shifting sands, as you will. That made me, it really helped me as a tool to explain who and what Jews are. And that's a problem with a lot of Jews here. So they think of themselves as a religion. And like me, like I was not religious, for many, many years. I'm still not. So many Jews here think, okay, well, I'm not religious. So Israel is over there. And that's what I thought too for many years. Like, okay, Israel is like a country over there. It has nothing to do with me. Like, I know it's a Jewish country, but it's over there. A lot of Jews in America, from what I've seen, they don't consider Israel as their homeland, right? Like they'll say like, oh, where's your family from? Or like, what's your homeland? Russia, Poland, Germany, uh, an assortment of other countries. When we start saying that Israel is our homeland, like, right, like my nationality is American, right? Like your nationality is American, but where's your homeland? That's Israel, right? Like it's not any of those European countries where our families escaped from. Like, yes, like our families spent the diaspora in those countries, a myriad of countries, but that's not our homeland at all. So I think it's that separation of thinking. They're thinking it's only religion. So what do I have to do with this religion? And then, like, I agree with you. They also say, okay, well, I'm so assimilated. I'm an American. I see these social injustices. Enter BLM, enter every other cause under the book. And I saw my liberal Jewish friends. They were marching for what was his name? Floyd.
George Floyd.
George Floyd. They were
But you
marching.
have to realize Jewish people
Mhm.
also, we marched during the civil rights movement. I mean, we marched for freedom for Black people, for Negroes in those days. They called themselves.
Right, right.
We Jews, we've always had a sense of right and wrong and moral clarity, but I think that has been
Hijacked in a way.
and hijacked.
Yeah. No, it's true. Well, marching for civil rights is a very noble cause, but marching for basically being engulfed in the BLM movement
is
is
a
a little bit different. Right.
totally different.
We're
And
especially, I mean, think about, whatever one
I
thinks.
don't know that Martin Luther King would have marched.
He would not have marched for George Floyd.
Sorry,
I have so many Black Republican friends. They are completely against the BLM movement, and they say, look, like any white person who's stopped by cops and is resisting arrest, guarantee you most of the time will be hurt as well. It's not just Black people. But no,
and
so
I'm
like,
not saying, but don't misunderstand, there is discrimination in this
no,
country.
right.
But it isn't, I don't believe it's institutional. I don't believe it's the system. It's bad. There are bad people who are cops. Some cops are bad cops.
Yeah.
Not all cops are bad cops.
Right. No, but the point is that I was trying to make is that,
and our laws are, this country's done a lot to correct the wrongs of the past.
Oh no, there's absolutely racism. Racism didn't, I mean, it got better, but it didn't go away. Of course not.
Yeah.
But it just, a lot of these Jews are marching for others when the others are not marching with us when we're in need.
Correct.
And that's so a lot of them are waking up to that, but it's still that fear of voting for Republican. And that's what I'm not understanding. And I know that there is a shift happening. So could you shed light a little bit on, have you seen the shift in person? Are you seeing it in the polls? Because, I hear that, in the polls, now it's in the 40% range.
That's what, I was at President Trump's event last week on anti-Semitism, where he cited a poll that says he's getting 40% of the Jewish vote. I'm actually encouraged by that, because it was in the mid to mid 20s before. So I think that's actually a good thing. Would I like to see more Jewish people vote for President Trump and vote for our Republican candidates? Absolutely, I do.
What do you
And
think?
that's a job of our party to really get our message to them in a way that they can digest it and internalize it. I think many of them just reject it out of hand without even listening.
I just don't understand one thing because maybe like you and I obviously were on the right side of things, pun intended, right? But to us, it's so clear that President Trump's actions were very pro-Israel. And then as soon, and it happened in dizzying speed, right? As soon, it's so hard for me to say President Trump because I call him Jihad Joe and Hamas Harris just because their actions are so.
Well, I try not to do that. I
Yeah.
really, if you want people to listen to you, you need to be more serious. I don't think that's helpful to the conversation in any way. I really don't.
Okay.
I try to be respectful. They were elected, they are in office. Let's put it that way. They're in office.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's just like I didn't call President Obama that because although he did a lot, against Israel, we know that, but these two built even more upon them and are even more dangerous. So to me, especially after October 7th, they didn't reverse course. So to me,
if you want to try to win hearts and minds, you can't start out by calling them names.
Well, I mean,
you can't. Yeah. You're not going to succeed. People will turn you off. They'll just turn you off. They won't listen.
I've had kind of the opposite because people, I mean, obviously I give evidence why I call them. I don't just call them those names. And then some actually have agreed with me and they said like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that they have done so many pro-terrorist actions, like against not just Israel, but against America. So for a lot of these Jews, they're not seeing that voting Democrat is a vote for Hamas, right?
It is. Today it is. In this election, it absolutely is, because you can say President Biden said at the DNC convention that those protesters have a point too.
Mm-hmm. Or he also released $100 billion to Iran.
Yes, to Iran. Well, that's even before that. Yes, there are a lot of things he has done.
And refunded refunded the terrorist groups. Remember, so President Trump,
he took them off the terrorists. Some of them off the terrorists. Remember? He has opened our borders to terrorists, to anybody who can walk across that border. Some of them he has flown in on these flights in unmarked planes. They land a few miles from my house at Westchester County Airport in the middle of the night. And
that's so scary. And how many terrorists are among those, who are illegal? It's
frightening.
It's beyond frightening.
What they've done to this country is literally criminal and so dangerous, and has put all of us at risk. So it is fair to criticize him and Kamala Harris. She's part of it. She's 100%. She's the last one in the room, right?
I think she's even worse, actually, because of who she associates with.
I agree with you. If you see who her advisors are, among her closest advisors, especially on Middle East policy, are members of the Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Semites, people who openly are anti-Semitic. So yes, it's a problem, and American Jews really need to consider that when they vote. But I don't think you're going to win the argument starting out by calling people names.
I would say, I would say
it's not serious. It's just not serious.
I respect
my opinion.
Okay,
but not the way I would speak.
No, and that's fine. I obviously respect you and your choice. My choice is different because I'm not trying to win opinions. I'm just sharing facts.
That's how we get votes. You have to win my hearts and minds and opinions. That's the only way to get votes.
Well, I mean, I don't say in a political venue, let's say, like obviously I don't give speeches and say that. What I do, I have a weekly newsletter, so I write about a lot of geopolitics. So actually I've gotten a lot of responses saying, wow, I didn't know this policy. I'm now also calling President Biden what I call him. And that and multiplies.
But I wonder how many people you turn off. Maybe, yes, you get people who, but how many won't read your stuff?
I don't
Because
know. My subscriptions have actually increased tenfold since the beginning. So
well,
I
for
don't know.
instance, I use my sister as a guide. I don't think she would, I can't send her what you write in the way you write it. I can use the information,
Right.
but I can't send it the way you write it, or it'll turn her off. And I'm sure there are other people like her.
I mean, that's fine. We all have different styles, right? So like, I think that the time, like Diana Bongino said, the time for being cutesy and PC is over, and it's time to be.
I'm not talking about being
Yeah,
PC.
yeah.
I'm not being PC. I'm just not
I I think there's a time and
calling
place.
people names. I just don't see the I don't
Well,
see that as
I mean, calling people names is calling someone a curse word, which I don't. I'm describing their actions, right? Like I'm not saying, we could go down the whole barrel of what's online about Kamala Harris and how she actually got into office in the first place. I don't engage in that. Many people do. I don't call President Biden all sorts of his mental health, his cognitive decline.
humility issue.
Right. And that's something I don't think that that's his fault. That's not something that we can blame him on. I'm only
Well,
commenting.
we certainly.
Well, I mean, if he has Parkinson's, he has Parkinson's, right? Like that's not something we can
I
do
don't
about.
think it's Parkinson's that's the issue.
I mean, amongst other issues. But what I'm saying, and whatever motivations Jill Biden had in pushing her husband, obviously, all of the money laundering.
Fair to
That.
criticize that.
Right, it's fair to press, but so
Fair.
all I'm doing, and people have said it's also fair that I do it. I'm not calling them names. I'm describing their actions. So Republican or Democrat, if we had a Republican who was acting the same way, cozying up to terrorists and enacting policies that supports terrorist activities, it would be the same thing. It's not that they're Democrat. It's literally their policies. And I, criticize those on the right that are anti-Israel also. We have some of those people that are pundits.
As do I. It's just
Right. But I think we're in a different place, right? Like you are very how do I say this? You're very high up, right, within the RNC. So you are not in a position to do that. And if I were in your position, I wouldn't do that either. From where I am and where I operate, from a Zionism education geopolitical space, it's something that I've seen it's actually celebrated and accepted. Of course, like I would not write it in a professional article that I'm submitting to, let's say, the Federalist or American Thinker. I do change, to president, but I have also had conversations with editors who said, I wish that we could use those words because we all say them in our personal lives as well. So we need to acknowledge who they are. And what I don't understand, it's
so we can acknowledge it by talking about their actions. I mean, we can talk about what they actually do, and that is that they support terrorism and they associate with known terrorists. I mean,
right, but it's also giving them deference. So to me personally, again, this is my right, like we're having conversations. My opinion, I have no deference for Biden, and I have no deference for Kamala at all. Just the way that they came into the White House, that's a whole separate conversation with the election being stolen. That has been proven. And again, and their anti-Semitic actions. So I don't consider him to be my president whatsoever. She's not my vice president. To me, they're enemies in the White House. And so when I talk to Jews who did wake up after October 7th, like my sister, right? And she's, crying about anti-Semitism, going to the rallies, but she still does not understand that a vote for the Democrats, whoever it was going to be, is contributing to anti-Semitism. It's like having blood on your hands for the next Jewish genocide. And that's like something that I'm not understanding the link that's going to wake up the rest of the Jews, right? Like, so we're at 40 something percent. Where are the others? Like, what's going to wake them up to realize that it's policies? It's not marches. Like, you can go to marches and rallies all you want, and have all the slogans like bring them home and
Yeah.
humus not Hamas, like as if
It's really not bring them home. It's release them now.
right. And also
Bring them home implies that somehow
that they're lost
it's
somewhere.
really the government's fault that they're not released.
Right. And that's the thing too. I again just being really forthright, the audience, like I always am. And I wrote an article about this. I think that the Bring Them Home movement has done a lot of harm to the hostages because they're on the left. They're blaming the Israeli government. I mean, I blame the Israeli government for not following up with the siege, but what do they think the IDF is doing in Gaza? They're in Gaza not just to avenge for the 1200 people that were murdered. They're not just there to make sure that another Jewish genocide does not happen. They're there to find those hostages. And that's the only reason that Israel has boots on the ground. Otherwise, this whole war could have been done by now with IAF strikes.
Right.
We're losing soldiers.
Well, I mean, the way the war's been fought, there are a lot of issues with that, but that's for another day because
Right.
the time factor.
Exactly. But that's the thing. So like you have, so I'm invited, I don't know about you, but I'm invited to so many rallies, like a rally a week. And I stopped going to them, not because I don't support having rallies, but they don't do anything. Like I'm thinking all these groups that are signing up for these rallies, much better outcome would be for all those Jewish groups on the left to just vote for Republicans. There we go.
Yeah.
So how, if anything, can the Republican leadership even do to explain that, like somehow?
And part of the problem is that people don't listen to the same media outlets, and the the mainstream media will not cover what we put out, what we say. They obfuscate, they lie, many Jewish people don't hear our message willingly because they're not using other sources other than New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN.
And then the ADL is also not helping. Did you see how the ADL?
Well, the ADL, they lost their way.
Did you see that they were attacking President Trump over what he said about Jews and
that is such a lie. I was there. He didn't say that. He didn't say
right. They took it out of context
completely, as they take everything out of context. As they still say he wants a bloodbath. As they still say he said people in Charlottesville, there were good people on both sides. Those things have been completely debunked, even by Snopes, a leftist fact checker. But it's very frustrating. People hear what they want to hear and believe what they want to believe sometimes, and they won't listen. They won't seek other sources.
Right. It's like they're just like afraid of President Trump. But by the way, so I wanted to ask you because
I just tell people, look, forget the personality. If you don't like his personality, don't invite him to your house for dinner. Look at the policies. Look at how he governed. Look how much better off the United States was in every way when he was president.
Absolutely.
Look at what he did for Israel.
And speaking of personalities, so I find that that's also false because I have friends who, have worked on his campaign and who served in his White House, and they say he's not like the left.
He's not at all. And I can tell you personally.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. So
look, he nominated me to be an ambassador. He endorsed me when I ran for U.S. Senate. He has always been encouraging and respectful. I wish he would show that side of himself publicly.
And also all his acts of kindness.
That people have no idea how much he's done to help individuals, to help institutions, to help. I mean, it's just. And even in New York, obviously, people know that, but some of what he's done. But it's just.
Like I just found out that he helped the displaced from the Gaza disengagement all those years ago. Like I had no idea. So when I was writing an article for the Federalist, he pushed back on the lie.
I remember seeing him at UJA Federation major donor dinners decades ago. Over 30 years ago.
Right. And he didn't have to because he was
He
not
didn't
running
have
for
to.
anything.
But I also know people who grew up with him in Queens. His close friends were Jewish. He's
And his
always had
right,
an affinity and a tie to the Jewish people, and he has no he has not there's no prejudice there.
right. He
He is
doesn't
a
have it.
philo-Semite. He is
Right.
a philo-Semite, and that's what people have to know.
He doesn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. And his father, Fred Trump, he was helping Holocaust survivors through the buildings that he was building. I know that he was very charitable. And then I'm sure you know the story that President Trump, I think about a decade ago, there was a young Orthodox boy who needed medical attention. So he sent his plane for free to
Hmm.
help this young boy to whatever medical facility he needed to go to.
I'm
And
sure that's not the only time he did
oh
that.
yeah, like many times. And then
Done
that's the thing, like it's just something that, true people who have that within themselves don't brag about it.
No.
They do those kind acts and then they move on with their lives. And that's the thing. So, and in a way, he's right, like not to push back on every slug piece that's out there saying like, oh, he's such a brute and this and that. But at the same time, I feel like we somehow, the collective Republican, we need to share those stories, but at the same time, we're not voting for friendship with the president. I
No.
right at all. Like
It's
I
not a social thing. This is what's best for America, what's best for the
exactly
world.
right
And frankly, as a Jew, what's best for the Jewish people?
exactly. So by the way, so speaking of Israel, could you explain the Republican trajectory? Because to me, maybe I'm wrong. If I am wrong, please correct me. It seemed to me that Israel was not a quote unquote issue within politics. Again, this is just my interpretation, assessment, until Obama came to office.
You're wrong.
Okay, okay. So
You're
can you
absolutely
explain,
wrong.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so can you explain all of that? Like
I can
when
tell
did
you that Obama came to office in 2008. My husband and I were were involved and knew the Bushes, G.W. Bush, President Bush 43. Um, he always supported Israel and he had a relationship with Ariel Sharon. There's a joke that, when he went to Israel, Ariel Sharon took him in a helicopter around the country, and he said something about we've got driveways longer than this country in Texas. So, but
true?
even I
Yeah.
remember he held an event for then Republican nominee for president John McCain at his ranch in Crawford, and Steve and I were there. There must have been, I don't know, 400, 500 people there in this huge tent. And there was one table, probably 10 or 12 of us who were Jewish. And it was a conversation between Barbara Bush, Jeb Bush, um, George Bush 41 and George Bush 43. And somebody asked 43, um, about how to be popular. And he said, well, I'll tell you how to be unpopular. You
Mhm.
support Israel. If you
Mhm.
want to be unpopular, then you support Israel, but I don't care about that. And I will always support Israel. And everybody in that place got up on their feet and were applauding and whooping and hollering and just so pro-Israel. And this was in 2008. Um, that's what I remember of the Republican Party.
Right.
Um,
Well, I wonder because that was already after 9/11, but I wonder before 9/11, right before America woke up, right, like to the
mhm.
reality of terrorism.
That was after 9/11. So
So
that
before, right. So prior to 9/11, was Israel ever a kind of like a football between the two parties or no?
um, I've always felt that in my political sentience as an adult, as a
Right.
Republican, I've always felt the Republican Party supported Israel much
Okay.
more than the Democrat
And
Party.
do you know
And
like
I've always been asked by my non-Jewish friends, why don't Jews vote for us? I mean,
right. I'll tell you, it's the number one thing. Like I'm part of a Republican club here that's mostly non-Jewish, and it's the one thing I get all the time. we have more Jewish members, and now they're getting the same question as well, because a lot of ethnicities they don't understand that at all. They say like, no, like, I'm Italian. If the Democrats were wholly anti-Italy, I would not be voting for Italy. They just don't understand that disconnect. So do you know why the Republicans were pro-Israel for the most part?
I think it's because of our shared values, Judeo-Christian values.
Well, I guess it makes sense because
and you know, especially among my evangelical friends, many friends who are evangelicals and love Israel and support Israel much more than many Jewish people I know.
Unfortunately. But I guess it goes hand in hand, right? Because the Democrats are the party of slavery, the party of the KKK, and the party of anti-Semitism.
That is correct.
And we literally were born as an abolitionist movement. Right. That's true.
That's right. It's the Republican Party, the Abraham Lincoln's party that freed slaves.
Right. So that's the thing. So people think like, oh, like, President Trump is using Israel as like a way to just get the Jewish vote. And I say, no, absolutely not. I said, like,
it's
even
who he is. It's
even,
who he
right.
is.
Even if there were no Jews in America, let's say like no Jews lived here, he would still be pro-Israel. I guarantee that. He because it's the right thing.
It's part of also the philosophy of making America great again, doing what's best for America. It is much better for America to be allies with a democracy, the state of Israel, than with a terrorist entity like Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran. I mean, that is at the core of his philosophy, is what is the best for America. And it's best for America to support Israel.
Absolutely. So kind of a shifting gears question. So moving on from why Democrats to a question that a lot of my Republican friends wanted me to ask you. So this is not asked in any way disrespectfully, because even like I want to know. So I feel like I'm constantly lately just being very forthright, having to defend the RNC. Sometimes they think the RNC is anti-Trump. They think like they're rhinos. And on and on and on. And so I said, well, I don't know what they were before, but I've been part of the RNC since 2020. And every event I've been to, the ones that I'm allowed to go to on my donor level, have absolutely been pro-Trump. Like I'm not seeing any of what they're talking about. So could you, as much as you are able to, obviously in the interest of time and obviously like not to give away
any, I do. I
but
limited time at this point.
Could you explain a little bit, like what does the RNC actually do?
The role of the RNC is to build the infrastructure to win the elections, the ground game. Now we've taken on election integrity in a big way to try to prevent any of these problems that we encountered in 2020. The way to win, to make sure they don't happen, is to prevent them from happening beforehand. The RNC is not, they don't run the candidates. The candidates formulate their own campaigns, their own messages. They do their ads. The RNC literally builds the highways upon which candidates drive their campaigns or their cars. And people misunderstand that.
That's why I wanted to bring this up, because
people really misunderstand it. And I also want to say, there aren't enough Republicans in this country for us to have the luxury of calling each other names like rhinos. I don't use that word.
Right.
I'm just
repeating what I
that we will disagree on certain issues, but I want every single Republican vote that I can get. And I don't want to offend anybody who calls themselves a Republican and say, no, you're not Republican enough for me.
Right. No, I agree.
And so I don't use that word. I am a conservative Republican. That's who I am.
Right.
But when I ran for U.S. Senate, I was happy to have any Republican support me, any independent support me. And if there were Democrats who were disgusted by their party and agreed with me more than they agreed with their party, I was very happy to have their votes.
Of
And
course,
that,
I'm just the messenger. It was like
I understand.
I had many text messages because you know, my friends knew that you were going to be on today, so they were asking a lot of questions about the RNC. So I just wanted to address any
And yeah,
misconceptions.
the
Yeah,
RNC, from as far as the members who are the voting members, like the board of directors of the RNC, yes, there are a handful who don't like President Trump. What can you say? But I can tell you that the vast majority of the 168 members, I mean, I can count on one hand and not use all my fingers the members who don't like President Trump.
right.
Okay? The rest of them are 100%, 150% with President Trump.
And we've seen that. Like I've
Yeah.
been to some of the same events you have, talked to the same people, and I personally.
But I'm talking about the member
Oh, the
meetings,
members, yeah,
not
other
donors.
events.
I'm talking about the members who are the voting members who set the policy and the tone and the, as again, fewer than 5 can I
Mhm.
think of that I know who
I'm so glad
don't
that
like
yeah, I'm
him.
so glad that you said that because again, there's so many misconceptions, and I felt like this is like one woman show pushing back, just like on what I've seen. So it's great to have someone who's an insider who has upheld the truth about the RNC as well. And so I know that we have a limited time
Yeah,
today.
I'm sorry because I
Maybe we'll do a part two at some
would
point.
be happy to do a
Yeah,
part
just
two. There's a lot more to talk about.
so
We
much
really
to talk about.
didn't talk about anti-Semitism in this country and,
Right.
you know, what's happening. And I have a perspective on it, having grown up in the Deep South and being a different generation from you. I really experienced virulent anti-Semitism in school and, you know, high school especially. I came north to get away from it, and it's just shocking to me to see what's happening
A
in
repeat of
this
that.
country.
Did any of that was any of that an impetus for you to run for office?
Anti-Semitism? No,
Mhm.
no, because I ran for office because I love this country and I thought I could make a difference and I could do a better job than the current reelected sitting senator in my state.
Oh,
He
yes.
voted for let's say he voted for the Iran agreement.
There needs to be a study. I think honestly, it's a mental disorder, Jews who vote for Democrats,
Yeah,
because like, and I told my sister that, and I said, like, she's smart as a whistle, but how do you vote against your own people when you already have had historical events happen to show what happens when those who are anti-Semitic get into power and then
yep.
support the decisions of that. But no, like, but you are so refreshing that, you know, there are Jews obviously in politics, right? You're not the only one, or you were not the only one. But what made you to me so special, and again, like I repeat this to everyone who asked about you, the way you spoke about Israel was so clear, so strong. The way that you express the danger against socialism, which obviously has been creeping into America. Some people are blind to it. Some people do you know what's happening? It was just so refreshing because I was so used to in politics hearing pro-Israel statements from the non-Jews. It's so rare, unfortunately, that we hear from Jewish politicians. So I think that you gave more clarity to those who are Jews in politics, not to be afraid to support our homeland because it's not just our homeland, right? Like if our homeland was evil, I wouldn't support our homeland. We're supporting our homeland because it's the morally right thing to do
Correct.
and not to shy away from that within the political sphere.
No, in fact, the reason, as I said, my husband and I decided that our activity, at least, and I have the luxury of it being able to do this full time. He does have a business to run,
Right.
but that we would focus on politics, take a step back as far as time spent on philanthropy. We still are very philanthropic with our donations, but we decided that we could have a bigger impact in politics than in philanthropy for the Jewish people.
You absolutely.
Politics is where the power is.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it better. And also, like, you're an inspiration, because I can guarantee that, people who are Jews, who are Republicans, who want to step up to the political plate, will look to you as inspiration. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And we need to, like, somehow figure out maybe a part two at some point as well.
Would love to do that. That
Absolutely.
would be great.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Laureen.
And thank you for a great conversation.
All right.
Okay.
Have a great rest of the day and early evening, I guess.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you so much. And Trump 2024.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, here's my there we go.
Oh, we should have worn our hats. I have my hat here too. Maybe I'll do that for the next one.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay.
Bye. I almost did. I do have a Jews for Trump t-shirt I almost wore.
Oh, I need one. I'm actually I'm part of Jews for Trump. I need.
Great. Well, I just got it on the website.
Okay. I'll be sure to buy it. Okay. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.